Hi, welcome to From Thinking to Inking, Episode 1, Part 6. I'm your host, TJ, and today I conclude my interview with Caitlyn Mitchell. Last week we finished discussing her book Shifted, so today we move on to discussing her post-Shifted projects, what she's working on now, as well as books and movies she enjoys, which leads to a lot of venting about the Hobbit trilogy. I hope you enjoy. Well, so that brings us to the end of the book.
Yeah. Woohoo.
5 hours in. Now I just wanted to, so do you want to talk about any of your other books that you've got
Yeah.
pending? So we could have the enormous fan base this podcast is going to have can write letters to publishers and saying, tell them that they need to print it.
We want to see it. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I've already mentioned Roaring Boys, which, is available on Amazon. That's my other self-published book. That's a 1500s Peter Pan story. And that was the one that actually caught my agent's eye. I'd already written Shifted. I'd already kind of put that one aside, and I was sending Roaring Boys out uh, to different publishers and agents. And that's the one that got my foot in the door. And, my agent liked it and wanted to start working. And we've been working together ever since. Um, so that one's available. And I've got um, four other books that are either with my agent or the one I'm working on right now. I'm almost done with the rewrites, which is a science fiction Sleeping Beauty story. I think
Which
it's
that sounds like a pretty
probably
cool idea.
I love it. And I definitely it's definitely I think the most ambitious thing I've ever done. Simply because it's taken a lot of it's taken a lot definitely the most work. I've kind of been at the a book a year pace for a while, and this book is all told it's going to have taken 2.5 years um, to get done. And that's partially because I'm not used to writing in the future. This is definitely a futuristic kind of post-apocalyptic world, which is very popular in young adult right now, which is why I chose to do one. Um, but essentially, society has moved underground, and there is a I got part of the idea from just joking dialogue that my husband and I have all the time, because he's a musician and he pulls a lot of late nights, a lot of all nighters. Sometimes when we get up in the morning, for me to go to work, he'll go back to bed after I've left. And if I've had a particularly long week and I'm still feeling tired, I used to joke, get some sleep for me. Um, and that's the idea behind this book, is that scientists and doctors have come up with a way to neurologically link two people together so that one person is always asleep and one person is always awake. Um, and that's the basis for the story, and that kind of ties into the Sleeping Beauty story, someone who's constantly asleep. Um, and so it is a young adult sci-fi fantasy, because obviously this neurological link is not something that could exist in science fiction, or at least I don't actually know how it would. And the science fiction I grew up with is very much like, how does real science work and how could it work? And so there is an element of fantasy to this.
More the
um,
Star Wars brand of fantasy than the Star Trek.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. But it's got a lot of world building and kind of interesting. I play up the gritty underground futuristic world against like fantastical elements of dreams, which kind of is more my speed of writing. And that's one of the things that my agent thinks is the strength of the book. So hopefully this will be the one that kind of breaks through. The book before that was a German Snow White that almost got there. We had one of the best feedbacks we've ever gotten, where an editor at a publishing house was like, I loved this. It's almost close to what we need. I want to read more of her stuff in the future. So whenever someone asks for more or asks you to come back, that is always really, really good. So I was sad that that book wasn't the one, but very much encouraged that we're making progress.
What
Um,
what was your twist on Snow White?
So that one was where Snow White is actually a changeling, and I wanted to explore what it would be like where Snow White. Well, one, she wasn't the main character. The main character, that was the first time I'd done a first person book. Shifted is obviously in third person, omniscient, and most of my books are. And I decided to try to write a first person story, and it's written from the perspective of one of the serving maids in the house. Um, and the first half of the book is actually about the Lord and Lady who get married, and eventually their child is Snow White. And because I wanted to build up this evil queen character. Yet again, I'm almost never satisfied with where fairy tales start, and where the villains, they get very little actual credence. And I wanted to explore. I did this a bit in my Red Riding Hood story too, but I wanted to explore like where how she got to where she was. I've never been a fan of fairy tale rewrites where the bad guy, oh, was just misunderstood all along.
Oh yeah.
The ones that I've read of that, I always find very contrived and obnoxious. But this one, she is meant to be sympathetic. The idea is that she's marrying this lord who is a widower. He lost his wife and his young daughter to a very severe illness, and is being pressured to remarry. And she's also a widow, and is looking for a husband again to give her credibility and power, and just uh, being a widow at that time period is not good. So she comes into this household hoping for a new beginning and for love, and she's not finding it, and she's constantly living in the shadow of this previous wife and child, and it's killing her. So she decides to make a bargain with the local fairies for a child, and gets one who becomes Snow White. And she grows up different and with these weird powers, and she's the whole time, her father is completely besotted with her and starts loving her more than his wife, and she's getting jealous, and then you start seeing the whole Snow White story come together. um, but one of the things I try to do, and I've been doing more and more with each story I've written. One of the best critiques I ever got from, I took it as a compliment, from an editor of one of my stories, was they were like, it's a rewritten fairy tale, but it's kind of its own fairy tale now. And I'm like, great, yeah. I am happy to take the kernels of old fairy tales and turn them into something completely different. That is to me a fantastic goal. Because all of my favorite rewritten fairy tales do that to a certain extent. The bones are there, but there's a whole new perspective or idea or story going on. So uh, the Snow White story definitely did that. My Sleeping Beauty story has taken it even further.
it's
Um,
more it's more it's more influenced by.
yeah, influenced by, as opposed to strictly sticking to it. Um, and then the only other book that my agent was sitting on that we haven't really discussed is, well, we did briefly. It's Jared's book, which takes place prior to Shifted, where he's the main character, and it's a Jack and the Beanstalk story. He gets a very tiny little note in there where he's got all these hobbies, and at one time he was trying to grow beans, but he dropped it really quickly. Um, and when Ava asks him whatever happened to those beans, his response is, they got away from me. Yeah, because they grew, miles high and went to another world. That's how they got away from him. So
Which I
that
love that
story for
idea because because it makes it so that Jared, who is probably the least involved with the story throughout the whole thing, of all
Mhm.
of of all of Lewis's friends outside of Eyeless, is actually the most acquainted with magic and actually probably could have helped if he had
Yeah,
just if Lewis had just told him anything.
yeah, yeah. It's a pretty hilarious irony. And yeah, that's a pretty fun one. And I based the whole giant society very heavily off of like Irish mythology, which had giants as the fairies, and that was a really cool one. Uh, but yeah, I hope they're available someday and someday soon. Um, I kind of I don't want to take any projects away from my agent at any point if there's a chance that they will get traditionally published. But kind of as we get further away from things, I do, that's why Shifted and Roaring Boys are self-published. Um, because it's been so long since they were written, and we've got so many other projects to work on, that it's safe to go ahead and release them to the public, as it were. And even though the traditional publishing market is getting more favorable to taking previously self-published stories and republishing them, there is still a bit of prejudice against doing that. So we're trying to keep as many books available as possible for when that first thing gets through. Because if we can get one book in the door, the idea is that a publishing company will look at a potential backlog of stories and go, ooh, maybe we can do these as well if your story does well. Um, so,
What
so
what was your what's your tweak on Little Red Riding Hood? How does that story work?
ooh, that one is probably the darkest story I've written.
It often
It
is.
is, yeah, and it was intentionally. I wanted to, um, yet again, it was one of those stories where I wanted to see what happened when I analyzed the villain. So it's a 13th century Russian story, and the wolf character is actually a princess. So you've got these, and the story swaps between their perspectives. So you've got this young woman named Svetka. She is the daughter of the local furrier, and she's grown up wandering through the mountains, and she's kind of your plucky heroine type. And then you've got this other young woman. She's actually from further west, and she has been essentially sold into marriage to the Russian prince to cover her father's crimes. um, and she's obviously very young when this happens. She doesn't know the language, she doesn't know the country, and the only person who comes with her is a single guard. And so she is terrified and upset, and eventually starts falling in love with her guardsman, who the only reason he came along was because he was already in love with her and couldn't bear leaving her. And so they have an affair that turns murderous ultimately. And so she's the wolf character, and she's always a villain. There's no justification of any of the bad things she does, but I wanted to experiment with when you see a character who is ultimately initially sympathetic. I mean, obviously, she's had horrible things happen to her and she's in a really terrible situation, but you see every opportunity she has to make a different decision and she doesn't. And so, in that regard, it's kind of like when you watch a horror movie and you're like, don't go into the closet. No, don't do it. And they do. And so, I wanted to explore the psychology of having the villain build up like that until she's at a point where she can't turn back, and um, so she is pitted against the Red Riding Hood character Svetka, who her grandmother is the seamstress in the town. She gets on this princess's bad side. She's imprisoned. The wolf imprisoning the grandmother and eventually consuming her. And there's a lot of like intense magic going on, and Midas, is present as the minstrel, and he's giving Sveka clues, and eventually there's a big revolution, and it's pretty crazy. I haven't, I have to read it again. I've got it on my list. I try to reread books I've written occasionally just to make sure, one, that they're holding up, and that always kind of makes me feel better, but also so that I don't repeat any ideas as best as I can, and also to kind of reacquaint myself with certain styles, or voices that I've written. So Old Blood is on my list to reread, uh, and it's interesting because for Mother's Day, I gave my mom a printed copy of all the books that I've written that she hasn't read yet, and she loved all of them, but I was really worried about how she was going to react to this one because of how dark it is, and there's a lot of tough stuff in there, and it's of the books I've written. I think it was the only one that my agent has pitched to both the young adult and the adult market. Not because it's necessarily like graphic in any way, but it deals with more intense kind of emotional and psychological subject matter than a lot of young adult books do. Uh, so it was able to kind of swing either way, which was kind of neat. But
The
that's
wolf character story actually reminds me a lot of actually Catherine the Great's life. If you've ever heard a brief bio on her.
I'm familiar with her, but I actually haven't read up on her very much. So
Yeah,
that'd be interesting.
she
I'll have to
wasn't
go and look.
Russian. She was married off to a Russian prince who turned out to be a psychopath. She had numerous affairs with various military captains throughout her life, and
Oh, geez.
uh,
Awesome. Unintentional historical relevance.
she led a coup against her husband later, and he died in prison under mysterious circumstances that people are
Wow.
pretty sure that she had him killed, but no one's ever been quite sure because he was also a very sickly man for most of his life, and so it's actually very
Right.
possible that being put in prison just killed him.
Wow. Yeah, that's fascinating. I it does seem the whole, marrying off unwilling women to rather war entrenched societies doesn't end well. So yeah, I'll have to go and do some research on her before I reread Old Blood and see uh, how close it is. That's fascinating. I think stuff like that kind of reiterates the whole archetypal, nothing. There's nothing new under the sun type argument, which I love. I think some people look at opinions of that nature and despair because it's like, how are you going to ever write anything unique if everything's been already, uh, uh, done before and every story's been told before. But I think that's fun seeing how stories relate to each other, even if it's one connections you were completely unaware of at the time. I think that's fascinating and kind of speaks to the overall like life story. So
I would recommend there's a YouTube channel called Today I Found Out. It just has it's literally just a whole lot of interesting tidbits of information. Some of the videos are like 4 minutes. Some of them are super long. But they have a secondary channel called Biographics, and they did one on Catherine the Great. That's the only way I know anything. It's like a 30-minute thing on her.
awesome.
So, so this is the winding down period. We're talking about your current projects and what you have worked on after shifted. What are you reading right
Mhm.
now?
Oh, boy. Well, I'm kind of I was rereading Shifted, for this podcast.
That
But
doesn't count.
uh, that doesn't count. But I'm actually in between books right now. I just started right during the holidays. I am currently obsessed with Naomi Novik. She is let me just really quickly Google her so I make sure I get like the titles right. I read first. She's got a novel called Uprooted, which is, and she's also got a Spinning Silver, which these are rewritten fairy tales. Uprooted is a, boy, is it a Beauty and the Beast story or is it a kind of Rapunzel story? It's got elements of a lot of different fairy tales in it, but it is its own fairy tale in itself. And it is just fantastic. It's, about this village that lies on the edge of an infected forest. And there's a local wizard who everyone fears because he takes a young woman from the town like every 7 years. And
Some
of course,
Theseus
everyone
stuff
assumes
going on too.
yeah, yeah. It's fantastic. It is so good. The characters are wonderful. The descriptions are great, and you kind of have to read it almost in one sitting. She's got another book called Spinning Silver, which is a Rumpelstiltskin story. It's a bit more
Knew
straightforward in terms of the
it.
fairy tale, yeah, but it's also very good. And I just started reading. She's got a an earlier series of books than those. Those are the two new ones that I actually discovered her with. But she's got the Temeraire books, which are about dragon riders, and it's kind of like if you took um, what would be the time period really, like 1700s, 17 to 1800s British Navy on dragons.
Oh, I think I might
And
have added this to my reading list. My Goodreads
they're
list is like 800 books.
yeah, 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 they're very good. They're very good. I've read the first three. I've got the next two sitting on my desk. And they're just so fantastic. So definitely recommend those. I've also been obsessed with Kristen Kashore, who did the Bitter Blue books. There's three of those, and those are just pure fantasy. Really, really, really good. Um, Let me see. There was another Russian like influenced stories are very popular right now. And who did the Girl in the Tower? This is Catherine Arden. Catherine Arden has a trio of books called The Bear and the Nightingale, The Girl in the Tower, and The Winter of the Witch. And yet again, just glorious kind of historical fairy tale esque stories that are beautifully rich both in culture and in uh, 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 just their own fantastical elements. And these books by Catherine Arden definitely use a lot of like Russian fairies and mythology. You've got Koschei the Deathless. I don't know if I'm pronouncing any of this right. Um, you've got references to Baba Yaga and oh, I don't remember the name of the actual like cultural name of the Winter King, but he's in there too, and oh, they're so good. Um, uh, so those have kind of been like the top authors who come to mind. Um, and then
Are you specifically looking for retold fairy tales right now, or is that because that's what you're working in and you just want to see what other people do, or is that just what you love reading?
both. I've always loved retold fairy tales and fantasy and fiction in general, and that's why I started writing it. But I also not only retold fairy tales, but I try to keep my thumb on the young adult genre in general, just so I can see like what's new, what's coming out, what's popular, so I can kind of keep a pulse on what is going on and what kind of can guide me to the next thing. Ultimately, it guides me very loosely. I'm going to write the books I want to write. And my agent is beautifully happy with me doing that. He has never pressured me to write a certain book, which is why I think we work very well together. But, knowing that Hunger Games and Divergent and, books like that have been very popular, I'm not going to write a Hunger Games, but the post apocalyptic setting is very popular right now. And that's kind of what helped me pick a futuristic non-idealized setting for my most recent science fiction book. Um, and so I'm probably going to jump back to a historical setting for my next book, kind of as a palate cleanser. um, uh, but it was a very good decision to do, and that might be the thing that kind of gets me in the door. After writing, four books in historical settings, but of course, now, these books by Catherine Arden and Naomi Novik, they're more historical again. So it's really, I would say it's like trying, to uh, anticipate, um, any kind of like gambling with the publishing market. Anything that's popular today is going to swing wildly a different way in a couple of years, or it could stay popular for a decade. You just can't tell. And whenever people sometimes ask me if I uh, uh, would love to be a full-time writer all the time, and I'm like, I would love it if it was financially feasible. But I feel like these days you need to be a J.K. Rowling or a Stephen King to make that work. Just because even if you have a New York Times best-selling novel or do really, really well, it's not a guarantee that what you write next time is going to work. Even if it's just as good. The publishing industry is changing so fast, and the way that books are being delivered to people is so splintered now that it's really hard to tell how things are going to go. And kind of like anywhere, the 40-year career is not really a thing anymore. You know, earlier in this segment, we were talking about that, like with music, you just don't really see the 40-year career that classic rock had. People who were able to stick together and stay popular for decades. And I think that that's definitely true with publishing as well. um, so I try to read mostly young adult fantasy and fiction because, one, that's what I love, but also because that's what I'm trying to get into. But I do read science fiction occasionally, and I'm not really into nonfiction at all. Reading is my escapism and my entertainment, and I don't really feel like continue. It's kind of like horror books or movies or whatever. I'm trying to find happy um uh, uh, uh elements to get me out of my day to day, or some of the sometimes the terrible things that go on in the world. And so um, I've never really understood filling my entertainment with bleakness. It's one of the reasons I didn't get into like Game of Thrones, among many others. But I watched the first two episodes and I was like, not a single one of these characters is relatable or likable to me. And
What do you
this
have
is like
against
the
Ned?
second. Huh?
What do you have against Ned?
Yeah. Oh, I didn't get to him. Well, no, I
Sean
think he
Bean's
does
character?
show up in one
Yeah.
of the first episodes when he
Sean
slaps the
Bean's
young
character?
guy. He went, huh?
Sean Bean's character?
Oh, I was thinking someone else. Yeah, I'm not familiar very much. He just wasn't likable, but yet again, it was only two episodes. I didn't really give most people a chance. But they killed off the only two characters I liked in those first two episodes, the kid and the dog, and so I was kind of done. uh,
The
I
books are
want
really
my
good. I've read
I've
the first
heard
three, and they're very
I've
well
heard
written.
they're also very brutal. So there's a certain element of, obviously, as a writer, I have to weigh the bad things that happen, or like being realistic. Not everything is pretty and nice. And Old Blood is definitely, my Red Riding story, like I said, is the darkest that I've gotten. And there's some pretty heavy stuff in there. But I don't need it, gratuitously described.
He
And I
actually
have a
does
very,
not describe violence very gratuitously. You would think that he would, given the nature of the show,
yeah.
but oddly enough, the gratuitousness that you have to put up with in those books is, oh my gosh, he gets into detail about every single meal inside of those books. Like even if people are like wandering around through the woods, inside of like a secret journey from point A to point B, it'll talk when they make camp. He will tell you everything that they ate that night, every single
that's
time.
that's hilarious. Awesome.
I don't know if he
Cool. Well,
like just
maybe
studies medieval culinary history and he just wants to show that off or what, but it
yeah,
gets comical once you notice it.
that's awesome. Well, maybe one day I'll swing back and read them. Because I know I'm missing out on a really influential saga. Um,
If nothing else,
but right
try to wait till he
now,
finishes.
yeah, that would be a good time to go back once he actually finishes the series. So yeah, someday. My husband watched the whole series and thought it was very good. Although I know a lot of people complained about the endings, but that's television and ratings, and
I was okay
that's
with
like a
the
whole
endings.
different thing.
I they weren't as good as they could have been. But
Right.
it was. I feel very similarly to them as the prequel trilogy for Star Wars, where it's like I can see what
Yeah,
they were trying to do. They didn't pull it off the way that they wanted to or needed to, but
yeah,
I appreciate what they were attempting to do. So it's like the bones were really good. It was just it
yeah,
got kind of fat and ugly.
Yeah, and my husband and I talk about this all the time that like today's technology, with CGI and all the things that can be done, it can be used to such incredible effectiveness. But I think a lot of people lean on it a bit too much, and that's what I feel like happened with the prequel movies, where they suddenly had all this money and access to all this technology, and they didn't spend as much time on the actual story writing. They didn't. It became kind of a crutch, and I've seen that happen over and over and over again with the unanticipated sequel. Where something does really, really well, and they're like, "Oh, we've got all this money, we could do another one and make even more money." And all of a sudden, I felt this way about the Hobbit movies, which I am already mentioned an enormous Lord of the Rings fan and an enormous fan of the first three movies. I just thought Peter Jackson did an incredible job, and the whole team and all of the actors. There were only a couple of things that I wasn't perfectly happy with, and Fellowship of the Ring is still like my favorite movie of all time. Um, it's one of those movies I can watch over and over again and never get tired of it. But
Have
the
you done
Hobbit,
the Have you done the full marathon in a single day before?
yes,
Okay.
it's intense.
Yeah, I've done it
I
three
haven't
times.
done I haven't done the entire extended edition marathon
Oh,
because that's
that's
like
what I've
a
done three
day.
times.
Oh heavens. Okay. No, I haven't done that. But I'm also a bigger fan of the theatrical cuts because obviously that's what I saw in theaters, and it made the biggest impression on me. But the extended editions are fantastic. So no, I need seeing as how this year is the 20th anniversary, believe it or not, of the movies. I'm hoping that they will
No,
re-release.
that'll be next year.
Well, technically it's like December of this year.
No,
Was when
2001.
the 2001. Oh, I'm thinking of when they started filming.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, it all gets muzzy. I'm on a Tolkien fan page, and there are tons of dates. But when Ian McKellen joined the cast in New Zealand, was actually sometime in January. So anyway, yeah, 20 years from when they started shooting. Next year will be the 20th anniversary of the release. So anyway, yeah, I'm hoping that they'll do a reissue of or a reshowing of the films in theaters. And when they do that, that's probably when I'll do a marathon of the extended, and just wallow in Lord of the Rings lore, and it'll be great. Um, but like, yeah, the Hobbit movies, I felt like they just had so much CGI, all of the grit and the dirt, and the storytelling that was so great about what they did with the first three was completely lost. Um, and honestly, also like it's weird because the Lord of the Rings movies are the only Peter Jackson directed movies that I like. He's got a lot of tropes in his other films that I just hate, and almost all of those tropes show up in the Hobbit movies, and I was just like, no, why did you do that?
I was okay
So
with King Kong. I really like Lovely Bones. Actually, I like that one a lot.
I didn't
Um,
see that one.
oh, that one's great. Saoirse Ronan is fantastic in it. Stanley Tucci is amazing. It's worth watching. It's dark though,
Yeah,
but
isn't it? Is it based off the Stephen King novel, or is that just a similar title?
I don't know who wrote it. It is based off of a book.
Okay.
But yeah, the thing that frustrates me about the Hobbit is there's a good movie in there. Like,
Yeah.
it's just got so much fluff. Like, and I'm annoyed because there's actually a number of fan edits that are really popular online. That
Oh,
it cuts
really?
down the whole trilogy down to. I've seen it done down to two movies, which was the original plan, and down to one movie.
Yeah.
But the thing that frustrates me about them is that part of the cutting is they cut all of the White Council scenes, and I'm just like, no,
Yeah.
I really liked that, because
I,
what I liked about was
yeah.
it made it a true prequel to Lord of the Rings, because that's one thing that you don't know unless you are a fan of the Tolkien lore is how
Right.
much what happened in the Hobbit affected the Lord of the
Oh yeah.
Rings.
Every
Because like
time Gandalf disappears, it's because he's going to fight. And I mean, all of that stuff. Yeah, that's totally out of the appendices. Totally happened. I love the inclusion of it in theory. I do
mm,
agree that I thought the scenes were really bad.
oh no, I
It's
love the scenes too, like the White Council scene with Elrond and Galadriel and Gandalf and Saruman, I thought was just fantastic.
yeah. it was weird because so much of the movies I felt like unintentionally became a parody of the original trilogy. Like Galadriel, for example, is beautiful and ethereal and gorgeous in, Fellowship in all of those movies. But like she spent in the Hobbit movies, and I would kind of be interested to see if there's like an interview with Kate I
Blanchett.
always want to say Kate. Yes, I always want to say the other Kate Winslet. I don't know why they don't look anything alike. Anyway, Kate Blanchett. I'd be interested to see if there's an interview with her on her perspective because to me, I felt like she did so much standing around and slow turning and slow walking in her beautiful dresses, and I was like, is she a model or is she a powerful elf queen? I can't tell, and it really bugged me. And I felt like in all of the movies, Gandalf was so much less of a powerful character. And I know that part of that they were trying to capture the mood of the book, where Gandalf really, you don't really know Gandalf yet. He's kind of this wandering guy, and nobody knows how powerful he is
He
yet.
was
So I
originally a
understand,
cameo.
yeah. And I don't know. I just felt very weird about the characters, how they were portrayed compared to the characters we already knew. I also saw a really there's a fantastic. I do say that you should only watch this series of YouTube videos if you're already not a huge fan of the Hobbit movies because it basically goes through and analyzes all the flaws. Um, but there's a really fantastic series of YouTube videos. I don't remember her name. She, unfortunately, I think her thing online is to take apart movies and talk about why they're so bad. So I haven't watched any of her other videos because I'm not really into the trashing things for the sake of trashing them. But her analysis of the Hobbit movies is incredible. It goes down into the nitty gritty of why the characters look the way they do and the problems that can cause, and why the music was just subtly annoying. The soundtrack bugged me the whole time because they were reusing so many songs from the original trilogy, including songs that had meaning, like the Ringwraith theme showing up when Thorin is fighting Azog, and I'm like, that makes zero sense. This was about Ringwraiths, and now it's about Thorin looking like this intense guy walking through flames. And anyway, I could go on and on and on about the Hobbit movies, and probably should not, for the
I
sake of
always
the.
was confused though when people were like, "Oh, I hate that they included all this Gandalf stuff," because in my brain I was like, that was the thing that drove me nuts when I was reading the book the first time was where
Yeah,
the heck did Gandalf go? I need
yeah,
to know that.
I did love the lore in there, and that they brought in the necromancer and everything that was going on. Because yeah, it builds up. It is all a setting for the Lord of the Rings. This is the darkness crept back into the forest. Rumors of a, this is all
Shadow in
the
the East,
prequel.
Whispers of an
Yeah, yeah, right at the beginning of Fellowship, that entrance, that's all what's happening during The Hobbit and before that. And so getting that in the Hobbit movie, I think made so much sense, and was fantastic. I just wish it had been executed a bit better. And ultimately, it came down to a lack of time. I, it is fascinating, this YouTube series that goes through all the flaws in The Hobbit. It's not just a slag fest of they did this wrong, they did that wrong. It also points out, the issues that they had with, the initial trilogy was produced by one studio, and The Hobbit, because of all the copyright
Yeah, it
issues
was
between,
a
so it was
debacle.
five studios fighting. And when Guillermo, I can't pronounce his name, del
Guillermo
Toro,
del Toro.
um, yeah, it's bizarre. I don't think anyone really knows what happens. He quit, he was let go, whatever the case. When he stopped, they basically threw out all of his work, but they didn't adjust the timeline. And so, you know, um, there were some CGI guys who like analyzed specifically the scene where Smog is looking at the golden statue that melts. It didn't get sequenced right. They didn't finish rendering it, which is why Riddles in the Dark, that scene is like the best scene in the trilogy because they actually spent the time rendering the CGI and doing it right, and everything else got rushed because they tried to cram 3 year, 3 movies of work into basically a quarter of the time because the studios wouldn't let them push the timeline back. So
Smaug
that's
himself
not their
still
fault.
looked just amazing, though. Like, holy
Pretty
cow!
good. Yeah, yeah.
And
But
that, I
I
think
wish
the
they had
biggest
used.
thing though is like, part of me is like, I kind of want them to make the Hobbit again, because
Mm,
like I want a good version of the Hobbit that also does the same thing, that makes it a prequel of Lord of the Rings. But
yeah,
Martin Freeman was so
he was
good as
perfect.
Bilbo.
He was perfect as Bilbo.
Like
They did cast it well, except
like
for Thorin. I
scene
hate Thorin.
scene one with him in it, I was just like,
Yeah,
I was already on board now. And I remember thinking, if they were to re-release the Lord of the Rings on Blu-ray tomorrow with him edited into the opening shot of him finding the ring during the
yes,
prologue, I would be fine with that. That would be a
yeah,
fantastic decision, and I
yeah.
would be on board.
He was perfect. Everything he brought to the character was magnificent, and I loved him. Uh, and Andy Serkis, absolutely fantastic as Gollum. Um, uh, and I have to say, like, I really struggled with Richard Armitage as Thorin, but I don't think that, yet again, I think it was just bad writing. Um, because he's kind of a jerk in the book, but more in a regal, I don't understand how you other non-dwarves work kind of way.
The
And I felt
usual.
like they were just, yeah, I think they were just trying to dramatize him so much. He came across to me as like the handsome bad boy. And there's a very interesting analysis that none of the dwarves really look like Gimli in The Hobbit, and in that way they have kind of ignored the world they already built, and they're trying to make a lot of the dwarves look like Strider. They're trying to get these epic, handsome bad boys, and now we've got four of them, and just whatever. And that kind of was a thing that got under my skin, and I couldn't figure out why for a really long time until I read somebody else write about it, and I was like, ah, now I understand why this is bugging me. um so the whole feely keely, they were fun, but they didn't feel like dwarves to me. So I don't know. But everyone has their preconceived notions of what things should be and what should look like, so it's very hard. um I feel like the fact that the first three films were so universally appealing is a triumph in and of itself, and expecting the Hobbit to do the same, um, it would have been amazing. It would have been a triumph, but it could be, trying to basically recreate a miracle.
Right.
um,
Like, you watch all the
so
special features, and all you can think the entire time is, these movies shouldn't have happened. Like,
right,
there's no
right.
reason this should have worked.
And the fact that like so many people who are not only fans of the books but also fans of the movie, that is so hard to do. There's everyone can say, oh, it wasn't as good as the book, but the first three movies, they really do stand up. And I think, I always think of them as like a separate thing than the book. But I can't critique them. There are a couple of things that they did that I'm not a huge fan of, but I understand why they did it because it forwards the story in the amount of time that they had. Yeah, they're just
what
fantastic.
What's your
So
opinion on
so
Tom Bombadil?
I like Tom Bombadil. I can understand why they didn't include him,
Yeah,
because he's
I
kind of,
I didn't read the books until after I saw Fellowship, and I
yeah,
had a couple of friends that had already read them, and they were just, oh, I can't believe Tom Bombadil's been cut and all this stuff. And so I was like,
yeah,
oh, who's this character? And I read the books, and my reaction after they leave him was, thank God that wasn't in the movie. Those are two of the
yeah,
most boring chapters I've ever read in my life.
yeah. I think they set up a little bit of Middle Earth lore, but they're not relevant to the plot. Because they talk about him later in Rivendell, where they're like, we couldn't give it to him because he'd forget about it. He's this older. He's one of the elder beings, like before the Ents or whatever. He's part of the land itself, and so ultimately can't be influenced by the ring. And so in that regard, seeing as how this is about the War of the Ring, it's not relevant. And I love that he's in there because it gives us kind of a neat idea of Middle Earth and the kind of people who live there. But honestly, he could have stayed in an appendix, um, and it would have made just as much sense. So in that regard, I'm glad and I understand why he wasn't included in the movies. But I do like him in the book. You just Yet again, it's kind of one of those things where you have to take the book and the movie as like two separate things, artistically, even though they're the same story and closely linked.
I have a book that you would probably enjoy since you're also a musician that I got for my birthday last year, well, with my birthday money. That it's called The Music of Lord of the Rings by, I
Oh,
believe, Douglas, or no, Doug Adams, not Douglas Adams, Doug Adams. And
okay, that's not confusing at all.
he is a music journalist that apparently, while Howard Shore was working on the Lord of the Rings score, he realized, like very early on, he was like, "I'm working on this. This will be the penultimate of my career, and this is extremely special." He actually was right. He started writing the score before they were, like, while they were in pre-production. There wasn't even a script. Like, Peter Jackson gave him a brief idea of what was going to be left in, and he was writing the score based off of the books. But so
Wow.
there, Douglas Adams was a music essayist that he really respected his analysis, and he said, and he basically called him and said, "So I'm working on something that I think is going to be one of the great works of music ever," which is kind of arrogant, but he was right. And he
Yeah.
said, "I want you to be with me while I am writing this score." And so this book is from this guy's notes of watching Howard Shore write the Lord of the Rings trilogy's
Wow.
music. And so the first third of it is just an analysis of all of the themes and what all he was doing. So, like, one thing that's amazing is the ring theme, the da 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 da, the
Yeah.
ring race, like, chord, the da 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 da. That one chord is the 9 notes that make up the that make up the ring theme smashed into a chord.
Oh my gosh. Okay, I just added it to my wish list. So,
But so after he does that, which is just a third of the book,
wow.
like I started getting to themes that were introduced in Return of the King. I was like, there's still a lot of book left. What else is this? The rest of it is he goes through track by track of the complete soundtrack and tells you everything that Howard Shore does in order, and
Wow.
it's amazing. Like, one thing I had
Okay.
never noticed is Frodo is, when after Gandalf explains to him what the ring is and everything, he grabs it. All right, we put it away, we hide it, we never speak of it again. No one knows it's here, do they? And then he does a
Yeah.
slow turn. Do they, Gandalf? And before Gandalf answers, Howard Shore plays Gollum's theme as a way of, before Gandalf answers, of saying, "Well, no, that's not true."
Yeah. Oh man, that's fantastic. No, I can't wait to read that. And see,
It's
all of
great.
that kind of leans together with, it yet again, it was a time thing. I wish they could go back, like you said, and redo The Hobbit with the time that they spent on the Lord of the Rings films. Because Howard Shore, every song that he composed had meaning, had its own mythology, had and so the fact that they reused so many of those songs in completely different contexts, it just doesn't work. And I feel like it doesn't cheapen Howard Shore's music, but I feel like it cheapens the Hobbit movies because of the other mythology that these songs are bringing, and they don't match up with what's happening. And anyway,
The
but no,
Lonely
I
Mountain
can't.
Song notwithstanding.
That was good. Yeah, and the new little vignette song of when they're riding the eagles, gorgeous, really gorgeous. But we didn't really get much more new music than that.
Yeah,
The
I
the
think
war
part of
theme.
that was, if you read that book, very few of his themes had anything to do with characters. They were
Yeah.
more about ideas like friendship and
Yeah.
heroism and temptation and stuff and cultures. And so, since it really
Yeah.
didn't introduce any new cultures or themes, like story themes, there wasn't a whole lot of place for new music. I think that may have hamstrung them a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but anyway,
Well,
cool.
so I feel like we've talked long enough now, and I should let you go. So I want to thank you again for being my first interviewee. I hope that it was fun for you.
Absolutely. No, I'd be happy to do it again at any point. I had a great time and I learned a lot about my own book from your questions. So no, this was fantastic and I appreciate being included.
I'd be willing to do that, but I would like a little bit of gap and interview some other people first,
Oh,
and we'll
absolutely. Yeah.
talk.
Absolutely. No, no, no. It's all about me the first two episodes. So no, I'll try to definitely send some people your way, and I can't wait to see other episodes and listen to other authors.
Well, good. All right. Well, thanks for talking. So, yeah, bye. Yeah, so my interview closed, needs some work. Well, that concludes my interview with Caitlyn Mitchell. The goal for this podcast is to create the most detailed collection of author interviews ever assembled. And you've just finished listening to 6 hours about a 400-page book. So I hope I've met your expectations. My next interview will be with Peter Meents. Meents is spelled Meents, about his book All Your Fortresses. It's available on Amazon right now, so I suggest you buy it and read it now so that the interview doesn't spoil everything. If you want to support Caitlyn Mitchell and her storytelling, it's as simple as purchasing her books. Shifted and The Roaring Boys are both available on Amazon right now. If you'd like to support this podcast, please subscribe to it on your preferred podcast deliverer. Give it a 5-star rating to make us more visible, and share it with your friends. I believe we are available on everyone but Spotify at the moment. They're dragging their feet and approving me. You can also become a patron on patreon.com/thinkingtoinking. If you're a writer of a published or self-published book or a viewable film or play who would like to appear on this podcast, you can email me at thinktoinkpodcast@gmail.com. Links to all of the above can be found in the description. I'm TJ, and this has been From Thinking to Inking. From Thinking to Inking is a bookworm podcast from Corticate Entertainment. Theme music is an original composition by and property of Hannah Ausband Scheidt. She may be contacted at hannahausbandscheidt.com, HANNAHAUSBANDSCHEIDT.com.